Hello, everyone. My name is Pelin Oğuz. I'd like to welcome you all to our program as we organize as Istanbul Policy Center, Sabancı University İşbirliğiyle initiative in collaboration with Medyascope. Today we will be talking about Turkey-EU relations, and I have two experts on the issue, and I'd like to introduce my guests to you. Our first guest is Professor Michael Kaeding, who is now an IPC, Mercator IPC fellow, working with us at IPC. Welcome, Professor Kaeding.
Good day. Thank you very much.
And my second guest is, as you know, is also from IPC. She is the Academic Affairs and Research Coordinator at IPC, Professor Senem Aydın-Düzgit. Welcome to you as well.
Hello.
Today we will be looking at the EU-Turkey relations from the perspectives of EU and also from the Turkish perspective. We know that these relations had its ups and downs over the years, and there has been this escalation of tensions. Also in the previous year, we followed the escalation in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that was causing tensions between Turkey and EU. And this was dealt with in different summits within EU. And also last week was the week of EU, and there had been an EU Council meeting, and Council's declaration at the end, the conclusion of decisions came out, and there were some decisions also concerning Turkey. And we would like to discuss those, and we would like to look at also, as well as EU Council decisions, we also would like to look at Joseph Borrell's report, since it was really the backbone of maybe those summits. So I would like to give the floor to Senem Aydın-Düzgit first, in order to take her perspective and her take on the EU Council summit. And within the summit, there has been a talk about the positive agenda for Turkey-EU relations, and what kind of a role would that positive agenda could play. I would give the floor to you now.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Pelin. It's very nice to be here. Now, yes, I mean, how do we evaluate the Council conclusions from a Turkish perspective, from Turkey's perspective, and how far can the positive agenda really go in practice? I think these are important questions. Now, I think, first we can begin with how this was perceived by the Turkish policymakers. I think the conclusion summits have generally been perceived as positive by the Turkish policymakers, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to avert any future expanded sanctions on Turkey. And while doing that, they also wanted to have the prospect of advancing cooperation on a number of policy areas, including, visas, migration, especially in terms of the modernization and the renewal of the migration deal, but also customs union, etc. So that is what they wanted to achieve, and it looks like they managed to achieve that. So from the Turkish government's perspective, the summit conclusions are fine. Now, having said that, of course, whether or not they are that positive for overall EU-Turkey relationship and in the longer run, I'm not that sure, because first of all, I think what the summit conclusions, not just this summit's conclusions, but if you put it together and if you evaluate these together with the December summit's conclusions as well, I think one can argue that especially these two summits have really consolidated Turkey's status as a third country in its relations with the EU, rather than an enlargement country. I mean, this is not something that happened overnight. I think this was something in the making. So it has been going on for a while. Already EU officials, especially, like the High Representative, Joseph Borrell, had mentioned on various occasions that the European Union needs strategic autonomy, for instance, in relation to actors like China, Russia, but also Turkey. So we had been hearing these things a lot, and we've been reading about them. And I think these summit decisions and the approach it never obviously makes mention of enlargement. It's obviously decisions are mainly reducing EU-Turkey relationship mostly to whatever happens in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, of course, this is, I would say, from a Turkish position, it's in the longer term, this is rather problematic because we know that EU-Turkey relations is difficult to pin down only to whatever is happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, one might say, well, there are other policy areas. I've already mentioned some of them, like the customs union, like migration, etc. But when you look at those, you would see that they are also subject to various conditions. So it's in fact very difficult in practice to achieve cooperation, meaningful cooperation, even in these policy areas. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the customs union and the moderation and upgrading of the customs union. Now, modernization, sorry. If you look at summit conclusions, if you look at Borrell's report, you would see that the initiation of a new dialogue on a new customs union agreement, it used to be subject to EU's democratic conditionality, because we knew, for instance, that Germany was blocking it, giving the mandate to the Commission to negotiate a new customs union agreement because of major human rights violations and problems with democracy in Turkey. But now it looks like the customs union modernization talks will not be made conditional on democracy and human rights, but it will be made conditional on the fact that Turkey opens its airports and seaports to planes and ships coming from the Republic of Cyprus. So again, you have this major cooperation area that is now linked to cooperation on the Cyprus issue, or Turkey's steps towards the Cyprus issue, which of course had been there as a condition for a very long time. As we know, this is the condition, on the basis of which Turkey cannot close any accession negotiation chapters as well. And there had been no progress so far for over a decade on this. So it's hard to tell that there will now be progress on this that will facilitate a new customs union modernization talk. So that's very, of course, dubious. And of course, on visas, it talks about people-to-people dialogue and visa dialogue, but obviously there is nothing concrete there, and we know that there are hurdles on that front as well. So one area where cooperation will seem to be most likely is the area of migration, because both sides desperately want to upgrade and renew the migration deal. So it looks like if there's going to be one area of cooperation in the short term, that's going to be in the field of migration. But even there, I think the EU underlines that there are problems with the functioning of the deal, such as, for instance, the low number of those migrants, refugees that Turkey is readmitting as part of its obligations under the deal. So even that area is not problem-free. So overall, I think, if you put these last two conclusions of the December and the March Council Summit together, we're looking at a situation in which both parties are trying to play into time, trying to, see how things evolve, especially in the light of the easing of the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, and meanwhile trying to pick up some cooperation here and there. But I don't think that's going to result in a major breakthrough in the relations or cooperation. So, we could discuss a bit more, but I think I'll finish it at that.
Thank you very much, Senem Hocam. And now I turn to Michael. What do you take from these EU summit in terms of EU Council's decisions and talks about Turkey? From the perspective of EU, maybe you can answer the question.
Yes, thank you very much, Pelin. And excellent, I think, first assessment by Senem. And there is not much to be added, except for maybe a little bit of nuanced EU perspective on the very relevant topics and matters Senem summarized and interpreted in a very interesting manner. Because what you probably, from an EU perspective, you have to understand is that in the end we have 27 heads of state or government coming together based on a report, on a joint communication, right, to those 27 high representatives, prime ministers, and presidents to get their head around the very, very, very important, but at the same time, over the last couple of years and months, very noisy and very unpredictable EU-Turkey, Turkey-EU relations. And so it is a success, and I think that is always something that also should be perceived as a success for the outside world, outside of the European Union, that the EU heads of state and government managed to actually agree on a text, and actually quite some very concrete, bold statements. And those statements are, and that would be my second point, next to the success to actually have a common approach formulated and put on paper by all 27 member states, that it's also, for the very first time, a very bold kind of conclusion from the heads of state and government in terms of maybe opening a new chapter for Turkey-EU and EU-Turkey relations. That, at least, that's the way how the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Borrell, would summarize and characterize those conclusions. And I think this is also quite important to be aware of outside of the European Union, that this conclusions of the European Council are considered to be a stepping stone and an invitation vis-à-vis Turkey to make Turkish-EU relations in the future more predictable, less noisy, or if you could say also calmer and more quiet. To the extent that we should go down on specific projects and that we should focus on specific projects. And whether this is leaving or giving us an idea about maybe the EU changing vis-à-vis Turkey and considering it more as a proper third country rather than an exceeding country, I think is a very interesting first assessment which Senem elaborated upon. And this is maybe something we might want to keep in the back of our head. This is clearly not, I would say, I mean, also here, the EU, the European Council, may have taken that road very much so, but at the same time, the EU, it's not only about the European Council, the EU is also about the European Commission, it's also about the European Parliament. I will maybe come back at this throughout this conversation we will be having here today as well. So I think that's very important. The UCO, a very important, the European Council, a very important player they come together and they manage to agree on a number of very important things, as Senem summarized very nicely, with a very particular focus on the strengthening of the cooperation on migration management. As I said, secondly, what is quite important as well is that it's considered from the European perspective point of view, at least, an open invitation for opening a new chapter on Turkish-EU relations. I think this is also, I think, a very important interpretation of the European Council conclusions in combination with the joint communication in preparation of the European Council. And that brings me maybe also to the role of the European Commission and the High Representative in particular, because when you read not only the European Council conclusions, but when you read attentively the joint communication, what you will see is a lot of positive narrative, a lot of positive language. It points to something we might be elaborating later on as well during our talk. It points to also successful cooperation projects, such as in a bilateral cooperation in the field of counter-terrorism. It points to fighting to drug trafficking, successful cooperation here. It points to successful cooperation on matters of criminal justice and cooperations with, for example, Eurojust. So I think that's also quite important to be aware of. It's not only this carrot stick kind of approach, and the heads of state and government coming together and offering maybe this time more carrots than sticks. But it's also about the Commission's role and the High Representative's role in pathing a way for, let's say, reviving and bringing together Turkey and the EU closer again. And that brings me obviously also to something that you have been referring to as well, and that is the positive agenda, because that's a term, again, it is not really new. It's a term from a European point of view, which already the Barroso European Commission used under the enlargement commissioner back then, Mr. Füle, in the years 2012 to 2013. And this is coming back again and again as a positive language used in order to revive the idea of bringing EU and Turkey together. And I think that's extremely important to be aware of, maybe as a third point, which I would bring into this discussion from a European Union perspective. But maybe we can talk about this positive agenda and the ways forward then in the remainder of this program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, we can continue talking about these different types and terms of cooperation between Turkey and EU. Senem Hocam, now I'd like to ask you that, because you have been saying that Turkey's position has been consolidated as a third country, and now the relations between Turkey and EU are mainly referred within the terms of the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, so the geopolitics play a vital role. It became predominant in relations between Turkey and EU. Looking at the relations between Turkey and EU from this perspective, what would be the consequences of that? Are we moving towards a more like a transactional type of a relationship between Turkey and EU, where like mostly EU side or sometimes Turkish side put their interests at first rather than values and norms?
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, I think that's where we are right now. I mean, the situation, because the important thing, or the reason why I mentioned, that Turkey is treated more as a third country rather than an enlargement country, is that, once you're beyond that sort of enlargement agenda, you are less and less in the orbit of sort of normative promotion of norms, values, democracy, etc. Mm-hmm. So I think that's always the risk of having sort of a third country status in its relations with the EU. Because what I think we've been having, so what the government has been doing is this. I mean, they've been trying to make foreign policy maneuvers, especially since the December summit. So what has happened since the December summit, if you look at what's happened, is that Turkey withdrew its ships, exploration ships from the Eastern Mediterranean. It started exploratory talks with Greece. It signaled that it's going to, support yet another renegotiation of the Cyprus conflict, a UN-sponsored one. And also it has toned down its discourse and narrative, not just towards Eastern Mediterranean issues, Greece and Cyprus, but also with a core member state, France in particular, with which it had sort of entered into a bickering game of words, both on the part of Macron and Erdogan. So it's stopped that. So it has given signals that it's changing its foreign policy. And also, of course, we know that it reached out to those non-EU countries with which it's had very troubled relationships with the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm referring, of course, in particular to Egypt and Israel. Now, of course, we don't know how those relations will unfold, whether things can ever normalize, but at least it has signaled that it's willing to take steps in that direction because it wants to reduce its sort of relatively more isolated stance in the Eastern Mediterranean, which also kind of pushes it towards more aggressive rhetoric and also more unilateral foreign policy as well. So I think all of these, they do not go unnoticed by the EU. And that's one of the reasons why we have as Michael correctly put it, a relatively more positive tone in the Council summit as well. But of course, what does this mean, or what kind of a signal does this give to the Turkish government? It basically affirms their view that, you know, as long as they can play the game correctly on the foreign policy front, then they can indeed get away with whatever they're doing at the domestic front. And in fact, as the government made all those foreign policy moves, which set it on a more positive tone with the European Union, at the very same time, so simultaneously, they had been taking steps towards eroding Turkish democracy and domestic governance at home. So you have Turkey withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention, a closure case about to be opened against a political party, and various other things that have happened very rapidly, one after another, right before the Council summit. Of course, these are the reasons why the summit conclusions also make a mention of democracy. So it's not that it's not mentioned, because we know that there are political parties and movements. And again, Michael correctly put it, the EU is a complex beast. It's a complex phenomena. It's not only about the Council, you have the Parliament as well. So you have political parties, individuals who are also very concerned with the state of whatever's happening within Turkey. So you have that sort of inserted in the Council conclusions, but not as an object of conditionality, or not in a very sort of strong manner, but I think only to show that the EU is concerned at whatever is happening in Turkey, but not that it becomes a direct or immediate subject of policy or policy cooperation. So in that sense, I think that's what a transactional relation looks like, right, with a third country. You cooperate on certain issues that seem to be in the interest of both parties. You make very minimal or symbolic mention of democracy and human rights. So the third country, as long as they sort of align themselves with the EU, or at least do not hurt European interests or specific member states' interests at the foreign policy level, then they can continue their business as it is at the domestic level. And I think that's what the consequence of this is. And I think this is a concerning consequence, given the fact that, you know, in the case of Turkey, what's happening at the domestic level is never really just the domestic, because it has repercussions on the EU through various ways and means. So I think this is a rather short-term thinking, but then politics is something that's made on the short-term basis. So I guess maybe we should not expect anything more at this stage.
Thank you very much, Senem Aydın. Very important points that we can further discuss, maybe a little bit elaborate on in our upcoming round. And now I'm turning to Michael again, because you were actually mentioning that European Council is not the only body within EU, and there are other bodies, important bodies like the Parliament and the Commission, and there could be some ways of cooperation in different ways between Turkey and EU. Maybe could you please elaborate on that, because
yes.
I know that you've been working on differentiated integration, and this is also one of important points in terms of your project within Mercator IPC Fellowship Program. And maybe could that be a way forward in terms of cooperation, or in terms of relations between Turkey and EU?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pelin. Before I start maybe elaborating a little bit of what my project is all about, and sure, offering maybe potentially a stepping stone for a short-term, let's say, stronger Turkish-EU relations, allow me to elaborate on your first part of your question, and that is the EU institutions and the complexity of the EU. Because I think it's extremely important what Senem just said, right? Getting the perception a little bit that from a European point of view, or from a European perspective, the future of Turkish-EU relations would be less conditional, that you could read the conclusions in a way that reforms need to be accompanied by measurable return to the rule of law. That's at least what the conclusions say, right? So measurable return to the rule of law. But that leaves obviously enormous room for interpretation. Not so for other actors in the EU. And whenever you want to start discussions on upgrading a customs union or want to adopt a customs union, you need those other actors next to the European Council. And I think this is something that we should not forget about. Maybe right now for the heads of state and government, it is much more important to set this positive tone, to define a positive agenda. Knowing, however, that in the short, medium, and longer term, they will be also other actors, European actors, such as the European Parliament, that will actually have maybe a much tighter look at issues as framed, measurable return to the rule of law. They want to be, and they will be, much more demanding on those. And I think that's important also in view of the outcome of the 2019 European elections, with decision-making in the European Parliament becoming also more complex from a Turkish perspective. It's not only anymore the two big party groups that matter in order to get the needed majorities, in order to adopt and approve, to say, yes, we go and support it, because in many respects, whatever you want to advance in the and is defined in the positive agenda by the EUCO, the European Council, will need to some degree also the support, and if only a positive support, by the European Parliament. But with the 2019 elections in the European Parliament, it is not anymore and only and exclusively the two biggest party groups. A third party group has become extremely important as a kingmaker, and these are either the Liberals or the Green Party groups. Now, if you look at how the Liberals and the Greens scored the best results ever in European elections in these 2019 elections, was because of this mobilizing effect around the rule of law, amongst others. It was also about climate change and other topics, but the rule of law was something that both of those parties put very high on their agenda, and also contrasting themselves vis-a-vis other political forces in the European elections. And their votes and support will be needed for majorities inside the European Parliament for whatever the future of EU-Turkey relations will look like. I think that's extremely important to not forget about. And that might explain also a little bit the maybe now a little bit more relaxed approach, you could say, maybe, by the EUCO, because for them the priority clearly is trying to revive the idea of bringing Turkey EU together by offering to open a new chapter. I think that's extremely important from a European perspective, at least, and also from maybe your perspective, from Turkey's perspective on things. And this is where my project then also comes in, and where also then maybe not central EU actors might play actually a potential role. Because what Senem was elaborating upon, and Pelin, you and me so far, is pretty much about the central EU decision-making bodies. And they are driven now because of Turkey's accession status. Still, it's clearly driven by a foreign relations perspective, by a logic of action of foreign policy. This is the dominant action, logic of action. Now, if you would leave, and that's the project I'm working on, if following the following argument, if you would leave these central actors and actually bring in actors, EU bodies such as EU agencies, you could maybe leave now and then this foreign policy rationale and endorse a more sector-specific interdependence action logic, arguing, let's join forces a la carte on and around policy areas that are of mutual interest. Yeah. So, and not to bring it up at the Commission level, at the EUCO, the European Council level, or the European Parliament level. Let's leave it at a relatively technical level, and that would be EU agencies. We have in the European Union right now, as many of you might know, 43 EU agencies. And the interesting bit is that they are operating in a number of very important policy areas that might be extremely important and are extremely important also for the cooperation between Turkey and EU in specific policy areas. They cover aviation, for example. There is a European Aviation Safety Agency. They cover environment issues, European Environment Agency. They cover border control, such as Frontex Agency, all matters of mutual interest and importance. And now here it comes. Turkey is already engaged in some of those agencies. In fact, my research shows that in a total of 18 agencies, Turkey is somehow involved in the activities of operating EU agencies. And that covers areas such as the Asylum Support Office in Valletta, or Frontex, the Border Control Agency, or EASA, the Aviation Safety Agency, or, as I mentioned, and that was actually the very first agency that started engaging with Turkey already in 2004, the European Environment Agency. And that is where I get into a field of extreme importance, because we see Turkey and the EU operating on a day-to-day basis very successfully, in fact, on very technical issues at first sight, but extremely important for both of us, Turkey and Europe. And it's interesting to see that even in the joint communication to the European Council, Mr. Borrell, in the report, we see actually references to some of these agencies, such as I mentioned Eurojust. So this is actually very often taken as very good examples for cooperation between EU and Turkey already, like in the field of criminal justice cooperation with Eurojust. And actually, in fact, right now in the Council, we have the new strategy on fighting criminal justice and the cooperation agreement between Eurojust and Turkey pending. So the ministers will still need to endorse it, but Eurojust included Turkey already in its 4-year strategy from 2020 to 24. And this is where I would love to see also the discussions to go more on a technical level, allowing to leave for a moment here and there this foreign policy kind of rhetorics and the foreign policy logic, as important as they are in many other respects. But I think in order to think about reviving the idea of bringing EU and Turkey and EU further together, these EU agencies might actually represent interesting stepping stones for a longer term, more reinforced and enhanced cooperation. And with these few examples, such as Eurojust, but also other agencies, such as Frontex, for example, or Europol, or the Environment Agency, these are agencies Turkey is already cooperating. In total, as I said, there are 18 agencies Turkey and EU work together on. And this could be further strengthened. That could be maybe even put more, could be actually become more important. And with direct implications also to maybe initial discussions on upgrading the EU-Turkey customs union, because in case we really want to go that way around services, that might even offer an additional argument to actually extend and enlarge Turkey's involvement in EU agencies, those covering, amongst others, also services. So I think this is something to think about, to talk more about. I know that in the European Union, there are not many people knowing much about EU agencies. I know that in Turkish media, there is a lot of coverage about particular EU agencies, such as Frontex or such as the European Environment Agency, but I might wonder to what extent it is actually also apparent to the decision makers and policy makers in Turkey that Turkey is already quite heavily involved, and that this involvement could actually be further strengthened, embracing the idea more of a sector-specific interdependence logic of action rather than a foreign policy rationale.
Thank you very much, Michael. We are looking forward to see the outcomes of this project, whether that would be a way forward to embrace this kind of a logic of action. Now I'd like to turn to Senem Hocam, and maybe also what Michael was saying. What do you think about the external differentiated integration? And since the relations between Turkey and EU in terms of accession negotiations, the framework has been frozen since 2016. Afterwards, it seems like EU does not really have that kind of a leverage or a big carrot as like as being a candidate country. We lost that kind of framework. We didn't lose that framework, but we lost that kind of leverage maybe EU had. What is your take actually on that as well, the significance or the importance of this accession framework?
Okay, thank you, Pelin. First of all, let me just say that I think Michael's project is fascinating. It's extremely important and very timely. Also in the sense that, when you look at international relations, I mean, in the last couple of years, or perhaps in the last decade or so, we've seen this sort of the emergence and the rise of this practice-oriented approach to studying international relations and international politics as well. And I think I don't want to get too academic here. I know that this is not exclusively for an academic audience, but I think this kind of research is very important in showing how, on a daily basis, to cooperation and working through practicing foreign policy, through contributing in these agencies or any other similar platforms, can have an influence ultimately in the longer run about cooperation and the nature of cooperation between a country like Turkey and the EU. So I think, from also a practice perspective, theoretically, this is very interesting. Now, about more specific question, your question about differentiated integration, Pelin. I think one can argue that there is already a certain degree of differentiated integration between EU and Turkey. When you look at, their cooperation in migration, for instance, in economic terms, in terms of the customs union, and also to some extent on foreign policy, more so in the past than right now, that Turkey already enjoys a certain degree of differentiated integration. But I think what's really important there, I mean, you asked about whether it matters if you're an enlargement country or not. Well, yeah, of course it does. Much of sort of integration stems from the fact that Turkey had to adopt certain parts of the acquis as part of accession negotiations. I mean, that of course makes integration more likely. But what we've been seeing over, again, the recent years in which Turkey started turning away from Europe and as leverage has started to decrease, is that this differentiation or differentiated integration became more notable in some areas than others. In those areas where there has been more and more divergence, in other words, where there is less political alignment between the EU and Turkey, you see less instances of differentiated integration. And foreign policy, for instance, is one of those areas, right? And one of those sectors. If you look at, for instance, Turkey's alignment rate with the European Union's common foreign and security policy positions in the recent decade, you'd see that there has been a rapid decline from about very high rates of alignment of about 70 to 80% or so in the earlier periods of the enlargement perspective and the accession process, where there was more political alignment between EU and Turkey, also in foreign policy terms. Today, that alignment rate stands at around 9 or 10%. Now, that is, of course, very low, and there's been huge reduction. So it goes to show that, in these sort of macro political issues, as Michael has also rightly put it, as divergence has begun to increase due to a variety of factors that relate to larger geopolitical issues about Turkey's stance in geopolitical matters, its relations with Russia, etc., etc. These all can be unpacked. But as this political disalignment and divergence grew, you see that integration, also differentiated integration, also suffers. Having said that, of course, that is not the case for every policy area. And migration, for instance, is one of those areas where Turkey seems to be very much subject to differentiated integration in the way in which you have a lot of Frontex activity, for instance, right? For example, training Turkish officials, Turkish border coast guards, and basically to ensure that the agreement, that the deal actually works. So again, it depends from sector to sector, but the real damage, or I would say the negative aspect of Turkey's distancing from Europe in foreign policy terms, in enlargement terms, does not always reflect itself in a uniform fashion in terms of cooperation and differentiated integration across all policy areas. So there seems to be a difference there that we need to be careful about.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to get all this information from both of you, as being like the most important EU experts about these issues. And Michael, I can now give you the floor for your final remarks and maybe some comments on what Senem Hoca was saying earlier. So the floor is yours for a couple of minutes, and then I will give the floor to Senem Hoca for her final remarks, and then we can conclude our program for today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I don't know how much time I have, but I will keep it.
You have 2 to 3 minutes max.
Sure. No worries at all. I think, I think what is probably most interesting for also the audience here today is to just perceive the potential. There still is a lot of things we haven't really tried out. And there is still a lot of hope, if you want, as well, in terms of give it as a positive spin, in terms of what we could test and try out in the short, medium, and long-term run with regard to bringing the EU and Turkey closer. And I think this idea about differentiated integration is a very important one. I think it's a very relevant one for the EU, and I'm here to give you the EU perspective, so I can tell you we have to learn in the European Union that the future of the European Union has also an external face of differentiation, and it's not only about us 27 getting our heads around specific policy areas, but it's actually involving third countries and those with specific status, like acceding countries, for and around specific policy areas. And I think my point here today was clearly showing also in the direction that we at the same time should not be misled by these different status of countries or third countries, but that there is also a lot of potential of maybe leaving for a minute or two this foreign policy rationale and to endorse the idea of sector-specific interdependence argument, arguing that in those policy areas we share a common interest, and that's why we have to cooperate. And EU agencies offer potentially a very nice set of actors where expertise, Turkish expertise, might actually be in need. And it's actually quite interesting, and to make this point very clear, that even after 2016, which we would probably all consider to be a date around which things got louder and noisier and less predictable in terms of Turkish-EU relations, that it was even thereafter, even after the European Parliament announced to freeze accession negotiations with Turkey, and we had a couple in the series of European Council statements pretty much directing in this way, that EU agencies kept on adopting memorandums of understanding with Turkey. We have the Maritime Safety Agency in 2018, we have the Asylum Office in Valletta in 2019, and we have now, with COVID-19 spreading not only in Turkey, but also inside the European Union very heavily, a cooperation between the EU agency ECDC, the Center for Disease Prevention, with Turkey. And I think that's what I want to talk about. Talk about what Borrell was pointing out in his joint communication to the UCO in preparation of the last UCO meeting, underlining and pointing at the very positive cooperation between the EU agency Eurojust on criminal and justice cooperation matters and Turkey. And this is, I think, what we also need to talk more about. I understand that EU-Turkey relations have been characterized in the past by a lot of problems, and we discussed a few of them today. But I think what is important as well is to not forget also about the positive examples that there are on a day-to-day, on a very practical basis, but they might actually help us and lead us the direction for a more enhanced cooperation between Turkey and the European Union.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now the floor is yours, Senem Hocam.
Well, I don't have much to add, really. I agree with Michael in the sense that, here we have two actors that are geographically have nowhere to go, like they're stuck with each other. And there are too many overlapping issues. The COVID case has just shown us that you cannot be insulated, right? That's just not possible. And that they would have to cooperate. So on macro issues, of course, we might have some deadlock for the time being, right? But if you look at the history of the EU-Turkey relationship, you see that it's just full of ups and downs. So there have been huge downs, or even in the earlier periods, and then there have been suddenly instances of extreme progress, like the sudden opening of accession negotiations and this whole enlarged perspective in like 3-4 years' time. So these things happen, but I think the most important thing is to make sure that both sides continue to engage with one another as much as possible, knowing also that political constellations change, not just in Turkey, but also in Europe. Michael has mentioned the rise of the Greens. And in Turkey, we know that we have a bunch of different political actors right now operating besides, the government coalition. So I think it's important to make note of that and thus, see the significance and importance of a cooperation through daily practices in these agencies and elsewhere, and to make sure that engagement continues, even when things turn sour on the more geopolitical level. I think I'm going to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Professor Düzgit, and thank you very much, Professor Kaeding.
Pleasure.
It was really nice to have you on our show, both of you. Thank you for all your remarks. And I would also like to thank our viewers, and we will see you next week with a new subject. Thank you very much. Stay healthy.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Türkiye'nin sivil, bağımsız, özgür ve çoğulcu bir medya ortamına ihtiyacı var. Medyascope 20 Ağustos 2015'te bu ihtiyacı karşılamak üzere yola çıktı. Ama yolumuz uzun. Bu yolculukta bize Patreon veya YouTube'un katıl butonu üzerinden katkıda bulunabilirsiniz. Destek verin, sizinle güçlenelim.